All right, let's just jump right into this explainer because today we're exploring something that is, honestly, one of history's most fascinating and profound paradoxes. I'm talking about the child monarch. You know, to be a king or an emperor or a queen, it means bearing the weight of millions of souls right on your shoulders. It's this massive, crushing burden that has literally broken the minds of grown, experienced men. And yet, for centuries, all across the globe, societies have occasionally just bypassed the strong and the wise and decided to bow down to a bloodline instead, even when that bloodline is flowing through the veins of a literal baby. Which brings us to a pretty staggering question. What actually happens when absolute power meets absolute helplessness? Just think about the sheer absurdity of it for a second. Imagine taking a heavy, solid gold crown, completely encrusted with diamonds and rubies, and placing it onto the fragile, soft head of an infant. We're talking about making a child a living god, the supreme commander of vast armies, and yet they can't even tie their own shoes, and they probably still cry because they're afraid of the dark. So, this brings us to what we call the gilded cage paradox. You see, these young autocrats were masters of their realms in name only. In reality, they were entirely at the mercy of the calculating, ambitious adults standing right behind their thrones. For these kids, ultimate power wasn't a tool they could actually use. Actually, scratch that. It was more like a magnificent, heavily jeweled padlock on a gilded cage. It just trapped them in this bizarre life of manipulation, tragedy, and pure survival. Okay, let's start with a mind-boggling number to really set the stage here. Zero. Yeah, zero. Back in 309 AD, the Sasanian Empire was in complete turmoil because King Hormuz II had just died. The Persian nobility desperately needed a ruler to prevent a civil war, but, ideally one they could control. So they gathered the Magi in the grand halls of Ctesiphon, and they did something that is incredibly poetic but also deeply bizarre. They literally took the magnificent Sasanian state crown and placed it directly onto the pregnant belly of the late king's wife. I mean, they prostrated themselves and swore fealty to a womb. They crowned Shapur II at age 0, literally before he had ever even taken his first breath. Or let's fast forward a bit and look at the frozen palaces of early modern Europe. Take Mary Queen of Scots. She was born in Linlithgow Palace in 1542 and inherited the throne when she was just 6 days old. 6 days! Her father, King James V, was actually lying on his deathbed at the time, his spirit completely broken by a disastrous military defeat at Solway Moss. And when he was told that he had a daughter instead of a son to secure his succession, he just tragically sighed about the fate of his Stuart dynasty and uttered this famous line, "It came with a lass, it will pass with a lass." And then, 6 days later, he was dead, leaving a newborn infant as queen. As you can imagine, the early life of these infants was basically just an absurd theater. Take England's Henry VI, for example. He inherited both the English and French crowns when he was only 9 months old in 1422, right after his warrior father died of dysentery. Just picture this. A squirming, crying, cranky baby sitting on his mother's lap, enduring these hours-long ceremonies, while gray-bearded lords are droning on and on with Latin proclamations. They literally had to fashion these miniature, lightweight crowns so the gold wouldn't snap the poor kid's neck, all while he's essentially being passed around like a political hostage by a deeply divided council of regents. Now, if you want to see how terrifying this reality could really get, we have to look at Russia's Ivan IV, the guy who would later become known as Ivan the Terrible. His childhood was basically this descent into schizophrenic extremes. He was a public god, but a private orphan. Out in the open, he's dressed in gold and sable, worshipped as God's chosen ruler by bowing foreign ambassadors. But behind closed doors, once he was orphaned at 8 years old, that whole illusion completely shattered. In private, he was starved and just horribly neglected. In the freezing, dark shadows of the Moscow Kremlin, these powerful boyar families, specifically the Shusky and Belsky factions, treated Ivan and his deaf-mute brother Yuri with staggering, unimaginable cruelty. This little boy who was paraded around as a deity was denied food for days. He was forced to wear actual rags. Prince Shusky would literally kick his feet up and rest his muddy boots on the boy king's bed, just laughing and completely ignoring the weeping sovereign as he literally begged for a piece of bread. Meanwhile, Ivan's few friends and tutors were being dragged away and murdered in the middle of the night. So how do you survive that? Well, Ivan retreated inward, and his transformation into a monster happened in these distinct, brutal stages. He started reading voraciously about absolute Roman emperors and practicing cruelty himself, famously throwing animals from the Kremlin towers just to watch them die. But the real breaking point? That came at age 13. During a Christmas feast, this quiet, ragged boy finally snapped. He stood up, accused Prince Andrei Shuisky of treason, and ordered his guards to throw the powerful regent to a pack of starving hunting dogs. No way, right? The court just watched in paralyzed horror. And then 3 years later, at 16, he officially crowned himself the first Tsar of all Russia. Now, Ivan managed to violently break free from his puppet masters, but ancient Egypt's Tutankhamun, he never really had that chance. He remains history's ultimate puppet monarch. Crowned around 1332 BC, King Tut was thrust onto the throne right in the middle of this intense religious chaos. His father, Akhenaten, had just completely upended centuries of tradition during the Amarna period, leaving a massive mess for a kid to clean up. And the crucial point here is that King Tut was absolutely not the mighty, glorious pharaoh that his famous golden death mask implies. Not at all. He was this incredibly fragile boy, crowned at maybe 8 or 9 years old, and he suffered from a club foot, a cleft palate, and severe malaria. A lot of this was largely due to heavy royal inbreeding. I mean, they found over 130 canes in his tomb. 130. He literally needed them just to walk. He was weighed down by these massive lapis lazuli collars, forced to marry his child half-sister, and completely manipulated by his vizier, and Commander Horemheb. He was quite literally just the convenient public face for their massive religious counter-revolution. Okay, let's fast forward to 19th century Spain because I want to show you how this pressure builds over time. What happens when a child's reign begins the exact second they draw their very first breath? With King Alfonso XIII, his father had died of tuberculosis while the queen was still pregnant, which left the entire nation holding its breath in suspense for 6 months. So the exact moment Alfonso was born, he was presented completely naked on a silver tray to the prime minister. The prime minister immediately bows down to this squalling, red-faced infant and declares, "Long live the king." Talk about pressure, right? This suffocating weight of absolute birthright defined Alfonso's entire existence. He never knew a single solitary day as a normal commoner, or even as an heir just waiting his turn. He was being paraded before troops in these little miniature military uniforms before he could even walk. And while he's growing up, his empire is literally crumbling around him. They lost Cuba and the Philippines in 1898. Having that absolutism ingrained in him from the literal cradle left him completely unable to navigate modern political unrest, and it ultimately led to his exile in Rome when Spain voted to become a republic in 1931. But perhaps the most cinematic and honestly heartbreaking example of this tragedy is Puyi, the last emperor of China. Picture this. It's 1908, and the Empress Dowager Cixi is on her deathbed. She decrees that the throne is going to pass to a toddler. So at just 2 years old, little Puyi is snatched from his wet nurse in the dead of night. He's kicking, he's screaming, and wailing this devastating line, "I want to go home. I don't like it here." And despite all that, he is carried away into the 9,999 rooms of the Forbidden City, surrounded by booming drums and literally thousands of courtiers kowtowing on the floor. Puyi's life was defined by one of the most jarring shifts of power in all of human history. Think about it. He goes from being a crying god of the Qing dynasty, this incredibly lonely child raising crickets in little bamboo boxes who couldn't even tie his own shoes because aging eunuchs did literally everything for him, to an 18-year-old boy abruptly expelled from the only home he'd ever known. He survived the Xinhai Revolution only to become a puppet for the Japanese, then a Soviet prisoner of war, and eventually, after going through communist re-education, he ends up as a humble gardener, literally riding a bicycle through the exact same streets that he used to own. So looking at all these devastating, really heavy histories across different continents and eras, you kind of have to ask, does the coronation of an infant inevitably end in madness, tragedy, or exile? I mean, looking at the track record, it certainly seems like a cursed fate. But history actually offers us one spectacular, undeniable exception that proves a gilded cradle can, occasionally, produce a truly great and enduring sovereign. Check this out. Against this huge, tragic majority, King Sopuza II of Eswatini stands out as this rare, spectacular triumph. He inherited the throne back in 1899 when he was just 4 months old. But his fate was entirely different from the horrific abuse and manipulation we've been talking about. And that's because he was brilliantly guided by his visionary grandmother, Queen Regent Labitsibeni, also known as the Great She-Elephant. She completely broke the mold of the typical self-serving regent. He became known as the Lion of the Swazis, and his life was an absolute masterclass in patience. Queen Labasabini knew her young king needed to understand the rapidly colonizing world, but she also knew he had to stay deeply rooted in his own culture. So by perfectly balancing this really rigorous Western education at the Lovedale Institute with deep Swazi ritualistic traditions, Sobhuza grew up to be a master diplomat. He peacefully navigated the British administration, successfully led his nation to full, bloodless independence in 1968, and get this, he ruled for an astounding 82 years and 254 days. That is literally the longest verifiable reign in recorded human history. Incredible. Now, thankfully, today pretty much marks the end of the Cradle Kings. The era of the absolute autocrat running a country in diapers is effectively over. In the surviving monarchies we have left in the modern world, very clear laws of succession have been codified to establish adult regencies. This ensures that if an infant does inherit a title, they're protected from the crushing immediate weight of running a state. But honestly, the stories of Shapur, Tutankhamun, Henry, Mary, Ivan, Alfonso, Puyi, and Sobhuza remain profoundly captivating to this day. And why is that? Because they show us the very real human cost of our strange historical obsession with bloodlines. We literally robbed these children of their most basic human right, a childhood. They never knew what it was like to just innocently play without watchful eyes constantly on them. They were raised in constant paranoia, taught to view absolutely everything through this distorting, warped lens of power. They were treated as living deities, but at the end of the day, they still bled and cried in the dark, just like any other kid. They were the masters of millions, supreme rulers of vast landscapes and endless souls, forced to carry these incredibly heavy burdens that have historically broken the minds of grown, experienced men. And they had to do it long before they could even begin to understand the world around them. Yet, in what has to be the most tragic irony of all, they were ultimately just prisoners of themselves. Their shiny golden crowns were not really symbols of ultimate, unyielding power. No, they were magnificent, heavily jeweled padlocks, keeping them locked tightly inside their gilded cages, entirely at the mercy of the adults standing quietly in the shadows.
Please like and subscribe.